Hey, it's Matthew Cudmore, and welcome to Story Behind the Stone. Today, we're crossing the Atlantic to meet Jay Singh-Sohal, British Army reservist, historian, chairman of the World War I Sikh Memorial, and trustee of the Commonwealth War Graves Foundation. In an age where stories fade and representation matters, Jay's on a mission to make remembrance more inclusive, more accurate, and more relevant than ever. Jay, thank you for joining the show and for reminding us that commemoration isn't just about the past. And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in.
Welcome to Story Behind the Stone, where we talk service, sacrifice, and story, connecting you to the past and the most interesting people in the field of veteran causes and commemoration. My name is Ryan Mullins, along with Matthew Cudmore. We are with Memory Anchor, a company committed to using technology for good as we change the way the world remembers. Today, we're joined with Jay Singh-Sohal. He is an active reservist and veteran and the chairman of the World War I Sikh Memorial. And we're really excited to have you on the show today, Jay. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Jay, we've watched your journey on LinkedIn. It's so cool to, sort of meet you virtually across the pond. You are super active in the veterans community. What is driving that? I have some ideas, but would love to hear from you. Kind of what keeps that fire burning for you?
It's a good question, and one my wife probably wants an answer to as well, because it takes a lot of my time away from family. But I think more than anything else, it's just a sense of wanting to represent, wanting to represent people that look like me, people that come from my type of background. And I don't just mean the obvious, here's a Sikh guy with a turban and beard, and therefore devout, but, people from my social economic background, people from inner city areas. I grew up in inner city Birmingham in England, live not too far from there, but in more of a rural setting in these days. So for me, it's always about kind of showing a sense and a presence for people from my type of background, social, economic, or religious, and showing to young people in particular as well that, in Britain, in modern Britain today, we have a strong connection through that significant contribution of the past, and not just as Sikhs or Punjabis or Indians, but as part of the Commonwealth. There's a rich, beautiful tapestry here that tells a story, but it inspires, and it should inspire people in this day and age and into the future to not just to serve if they want to put on a uniform and serve that way, but actually just to help those who serve. Not everyone is able to serve, but we are certainly able to support those veterans or the military community at large. So that's always been my kind of driving thrust for everything I've done, is just making sure we've got representation.
It's clear that it's influenced a lot of your work, and you can see, from that service to now being the chairman of the World War I Sikh Memorial. I'm kind of curious if you back us up and just let us know a little bit about, like, how did you get into the military? How did this go, and then what sparked this continued service that looks a little different?
I think it's one of those kind of at so many moments there were kind of these sliding door occasions where I could have gone either way. So, as a young person growing up in inner city Birmingham, as I said, I was an air cadet, as they were then. So I was a 15, 16-year-old getting onto a bus, traveling about 5 or 6 miles up the road to go to an air cadet unit, putting on a uniform, doing all that, which my parents encouraged because it kept me out of trouble. And I wanted to join the RAF, the Royal Air Force, after my schooling, but they found me to have a slight problem with my eyesight, so that didn't quite work out. But I ended up going to university, concentrating on my academic studies, traveled abroad with my studies, and worked abroad as well in Washington DC. So I had very much a wonderful experience of travel and people and cultures, and also kind of getting out of my comfort zone, which for someone who's never lived away from home until the age of 18 and going to university was quite a big deal. Certainly living abroad in my family, I'm the oldest child, and grandchild was quite a big deal in my family. But it was always kind of bugging me in the background that, I had this inkling and an interest in military service. Not that anyone in my family ever had an inkling or interest. And I think it's a slight kind of soft spot, because when I tried delving into this and asking, what did my great-grandparents do during Empire, there's a little bit of rebellion there. There's a little bit of rebelliousness. I think they're on the other side, but never quite fully understood that story, and nor has anyone told me, but it's one for the future. But kind of, mid to late 20s, had another opportunity when I was a television journalist and kind of looking into the reserves for a story, in fact, for a news story. And I thought, you know what, I've still got, I'm still young, I'm still physically active. Um, and if I kind of, if I don't kind of pursue or at least explore now, I never will, and I'll probably regret it. So at the age of about 27, I think I was at the time, I applied for the reserves, got into the reserves in the end with the intelligence corps, and haven't looked back. And that was 16 years ago. So that's the kind of the reservist bit. Alongside that, again, sliding doors and so many kind of opportunities that just kind of sprung themselves, or kind of sensing a bit of an opportunity, mostly not just to serve, but also to represent, as I said earlier. And the Sikh Memorial was one. The community was talking for a long period of time about why there wasn't any physical representation of Sikh military service, and I took it upon myself to create that at the National Memorial Arboretum in the middle of England. And then that led to another opportunity, because that was noticed by some very, very important people, to be invited onto the Commonwealth War Graves Foundation, the charitable arm of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission that looks after commemoration sites worldwide. So I think, being in the right place at the right time, but also kind of probably more important than that, just having the right attitude. I think, being positive, pragmatic, making friends, but also being someone that people can feel that actually, you know what, here's someone who's going to work hard, and is driven to help tell that story and help represent.
I'm interested to hear a little bit, like, what is that experience, and how did that spark that interest in working with the World War One Sikh Memorial?
Yeah, I think kind of physical identity for Sikhs, as is obvious, is quite distinct and unique. I mean, we stand out. We stand out for a reason. We maintain uncut hair, so we tie a turban. Men and women, in fact, in this day and age, women also do as well. For men, more so, the beard is more prominent, or most prominent. So identity for us is a very, very physical element, and I think applying that in military service, it's the reason why we have this identity. We can never hide or shy away, and therefore, when there is wrongdoing, or when there is a stand to be made, and if there's intolerance or injustice, it's incumbent upon a Sikh to take a stand and to help protect those in need, or requiring assistance, etc. That's why we were given this physical identity. And that's a very important part of our faith and ethos. And I think when you apply it in a military setting, reservist or regular or otherwise, it's obvious you stand out. It's obvious, you have a uniform, which is, something to be proud of, wearing the King's uniform as he is now. But, distinct pattern, my uniform would be different to yours, will be different to the US, etc. But, it's something that you can have a lot of pride in, but it also sums up who you are. And then when you're a Sikh, more so, because you've got that extra oomph, that that says a lot about you. And I think, in the British military, we talk about values and standards, and that's the physical representation of values and standards for us is our identity. But I think it then means wherever you're working, or whichever environment you've gone into. And for me, I've been on operations abroad, particularly in the Middle East. I've served in NATO and UN settings worldwide. You mentioned Koreans. I've worked alongside Koreans in Korea and elsewhere. Never been to Canada, by the way. Maybe you guys can get me out there.
Well,
But never been to Canada. Been to the US and served in the US as well in uniform. But it just means then that you bring something, you bring a capability, or an insight, or a cultural mindset that isn't homogenous, is different, and therefore when you're looking at a problem set, or you're looking at how you tackle an issue, you can bring new ideas and different, unique perspectives. And I think that's always been an empowering quality, not just for myself, but everyone or anyone I see from different walks of life in any military, when I understand, or I can see that they are different, or come from a different background, or indeed, the most important thing, speak a different language, or are from a different culture, it means to me that they're bringing skills, and therefore they'll be an asset away from your textbook type of situation where people just think and feel the same thing. We don't want that in a military. That is more about problem solving and being creative and innovative about how we address issues. And that's an empowerment.
I think there's that stereotype of military personnel being, yes, sir, I'll do that, and just don't think for yourself. Where the reality of it is you need that diversity of thought. You need that ability to problem solve. And what I hear you saying, and which I agree with, because I do a lot of leadership consulting, and we talk about diversity. a lot the benefit of other cultures is sometimes they bring in a unique way of seeing and thinking. And when those come together and we have multiple, we tend to see the big picture in a better way.
Absolutely, and it's got to be that way if you're wanting to be ahead of the curve, getting ahead of the problem and finding solutions. You've got to really think outside of the box. We talk about a lot of outside of the box thinking in all sorts of industries. The practical reality is you can't do that if everyone thinks and feels the same way. Let alone then adding on top people's experiences, which when you come from diverse walks of life, is really empowering to have that in a team setting. But it always comes down to that team setting. We can talk about the strategic corporal, and but it works across all ranks, and through the officer corps as well. Being able to bring those experiences and viewpoints, and being able to in a team problem solve and think of also, if you're talking about an adversary or an enemy or the other side, if you like, and you're red teaming, how others might address or approach your plan in a military setting. But also, if you've got a plan or you've got a course of action, as we say, what are the second and third order effects? And sometimes getting outside of the box and having that mindset that enables you a lot easier to do it, means you can think about things that haven't often been thought. And I often think about this, just to kind of sum this up, in that I've got a dual identity in the sense that I'm very much quintessentially English. I suppose my friends have described me as British, but English, having grown up in England. But I'm also Punjabi, Indian. So kind of this is both a Western cultural mindset, but also an Eastern way of thinking about things, which I find quite empowering in my workplace, but in everything I do, in being able to look at different things. And as an example, traditionalist communities and non-traditional communities is a good way of kind of thinking about it, looking at and understanding actually how in certain parts of the world or with certain cultures there is more of a traditional setting which we in the West don't often appreciate or value or understand, because our mindset is often more individualistic rather than traditional.
As I'm hearing you talk, and I'm getting really interested, because I'm seeing that reflection, that experience, the cultural aspects that are so important to you. And one of the things Matt and I are always looking at is this space of commemoration and remembrance. And I'm curious on how that has now come to play a role in what you do in the space of commemoration.
It's a very important part of what I now do, but also what I've done for a long period of time. I think I grew up in a household kind of, as a young child where understanding Sikh military history was really important. From my father, from my family, going visits to the Gurdwara, and having that sense of history, and also what we as a people, as Sikhs, are about. And therefore, when I grew up, kind of getting into schooling and beyond schooling, just thinking, well, why are people that look like me or came from the Indian subcontinent not celebrated in the same way as others from different walks of life? And the more I got into it and started to kind of effectively, it started from reading and researching, just reading books. Reading into stories about the Anzacs at Gallipoli, for example, and finding out actually Indians were there alongside them, and seeing where the Canadians had served, and seeing actually, as part of the Commonwealth contribution, Indians were also there as well. And from there, just kind of being able to then think more about and try to figure out how to tell that story. And so when that community need arose for the Sikh Memorial, it's something I felt quite strongly about leading. And thereafter, with the invitation to join the Commonwealth War Graves Foundation, it felt kind of significant and important, but also a culmination and a build-up. I say a culmination. It's been nearly 10 years now, and it's still continuing, and I really enjoy it. But it's another type of service. It's a different type of service where you can think of it as the ultimate type of service. In fact, remembering our veterans from across the Commonwealth family, and ensuring that their sacrifice, their service inspires current and future generations. But it's also about kind of enabling that storytelling to reach new and distinct audiences, and just not relying on people knowing or finding out about it. We have this big criticism, or critique, I should say, even in the UK schooling system, where children at schools aren't taught or told about the Commonwealth contribution. My response to that was just to create a teacher training aid, understanding that teachers just didn't have the time to put together the work plans themselves. So we created it, got some funding from the Armed Forces Covenant, created it and sent it out for free. to teach us, so that they had a resource. And similarly with all my short films I've made over the years, just sticking them on YouTube and on the website and saying, look, this is a resource, and we can signpost it to you. In addition to that, happy always to visit places and speak about the contribution. But it's about being able to make sure that that story, that contribution and sacrifice, is reaching all audiences, and it doesn't become like the privileged elites that understand and know about it. And just to find, again, I'm talking for a lot, taking a lot of time talking, but just wrapping this up, there's a whole generation of senior veterans who will know more about the Sikh contribution more than I know, because they not only served alongside Sikhs during World War II. Sadly, the World War I generation is hardly with us anymore. But also because they were raised on the stories of their great uncles or uncles who'd had that experience. And we're finding a situation now where that oral tradition of passing on stories is sadly dying out. And I say this with the Chindits in mind, so I support the Chindit Society in their gatherings annually, and there's a connection there with my own military service. And I've been to some of those battlegrounds in Burma with my unit. They always think positively about Sikhs. And it's about kind of harnessing that story, not just about Sikhs, but the Commonwealth generally, and making sure that young people feel that connection to that.
Maybe it feels like forever ago, but you traveled down to Cape Town, South Africa. What did it mean to you to kind of be on site and see something so symbolic, so important, so new, kind of come together?
It was an amazing experience. First time in South Africa, or indeed first time in Africa. I felt quite strongly that the work that we do with the Commonwealth War Graves has been significant with the non-commemoration project in particular, which is about ensuring that those who, for whatever reason, and there usually are good reasons, were not commemorated previously for their services and sacrifice, are finding a way of being remembered. And a large contingent of that was, or still is, the Labour Corps. So the Labour Corps, they weren't soldiers, but they were effectively, in the field with soldiers. The Labour Corps on the Western Front were the ones who were doing a lot of the digging into trenches. Elsewhere, the Labour Corps drawn from Africa were the ones doing a lot of the manual carrying and labour work in those theatres of operation. But for a long time, they weren't remembered, recognised for their contribution. And kind of, the pragmatic Commonwealth War Graves Commission, looking at that and wanting to connect and tell that story over a number of years, has had a program of, firstly doing the research, because a lot of their names and a lot of the details of these individuals who were part of that African Labour Corps just didn't exist, or the information was easy to get hold of. So from my perspective as a trustee, just seeing this program develop and evolve, and seeing how it was gathering pace, but also connecting with local communities in those spaces, not just in Cape Town, South Africa, but also the projects that we've got in Sierra Leone and Kenya as well, and bringing the communities and taking the communities with us, with telling that story of past sacrifice. So when the opportunity came, and indeed it was the unveiling of the South African Labour Corps Memorial in Cape Town, I felt quite strongly about going along to witness it and bear witness, and also kind of support as much as I could. So I took myself out there and was quite happy and proud to be able to be a part of that. Immersion into the local community and culture, but also understanding how it had come about, and being able to kind of tell that story back in the UK to those who support our work. So it was fantastic opportunity, but also quite unique as well. In the park where that memorial was created, very different to those colonial era memorials. I think it helps tell the story that this was a means of the community being engaged and finding a meaning relevant way of helping them commemorate, which is very different to seeing, what we often see in London and maybe elsewhere, which is typically a white Western male on top of a horse somewhere. And ensuring that the memorial was something that was locally produced and sourced, and local people could feel connection with the names of those who were being remembered on it.
That's been a big problem kind of historically, and I think it's taken a lot of courage and a lot of effort to really look at this idea of non-commemoration. Do you want to maybe explain a little bit to our listeners what this non-commemoration really, what it is and why it's so important?
So the then Imperial War Graves Commission, as an organisation, founded more than 100 years ago, was very much about ensuring that those who fought and died, particularly on the Western Front in Europe, in Western Europe, were remembered, and there was it was a kind of a fair and egalitarian process across the board, with whether you were a junior soldier or a senior general officer, and it was very much focused on soldiers, because soldiers were doing the fighting, soldiers were the ones dying, and for the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, as it became, the work and the role was about looking after those sites of those, the war dead, whether they be buried, so Christians, Muslims being buried, or indeed if you were Sikh or Hindu and cremated, ensuring that the space where you are remembered, or your names might very well be on a wall somewhere, in remembrance of your service and sacrifice, those sites are remembered. And often you get, I remember in Burma, outside of Rangoon, Tokyan War Graves Cemetery, you see that there are people buried, but there are also people remembered on a wall who were cremated, and you see that in different sites as well. And looking after those spaces worldwide is the kind of the work and the remit of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. But these were soldiers, as I said. So what would have gone for a very long time unremembered or overlooked would have been those who are from a non-soldiering background. So your labourers, for example, as I described earlier, labourers would have been those carrying bags, on expeditions, or doing a lot of the manual labour work. Not just in Europe. In Europe, we had Chinese labourers that were brought over who did a lot of the digging and redigging for those who died and were buried. But also in East Africa, in the expeditionary forces and the campaigns there, where a lot of the Africa Corps would have been brought over, the Indian Corps as well on the labouring side. So for a very long time, they weren't given the same recognition because they just weren't soldiers. They weren't fighting, but they still were involved. So the non-commemoration project is very much about ensuring that those who did have a part to play, and it was an important part that they played, are also able to be remembered. But as you can imagine, with record keeping and records, soldiers, there's more of a paper trail around soldiers, because they would have gone through certain levels of training. They would have been given certain levels of pay or stipend if they were entitled to one by going abroad. The regimental system meant that there was more effective record keeping. For the Labour Corps, those sorts of records didn't exist in the same way, because they weren't administered in the same way. It's probably the easiest way of putting it. And therefore, the commission has taken quite painstakingly quite a lot of work to try finding as many names of individuals from the Labour side as possible. Often, a lot of these Labour Corps individuals, certainly with the African Labour Corps, they would have just been a first name only, a single name, and maybe a village. And as you can imagine, trying to piece this all together and trying to kind of get a sense and an understanding of where people were drawn from to serve in that Labour Corps sense, and then eventually to find a meaningful tribute to them, has been rather painstaking by the Commission. Kind of what part I've been able to play with this has been kind of through the foundation, so the charitable arm of the Commission, which is very much about how we tell that story far and wide to diverse audiences, and through through the research that's undertaken and events that take place worldwide, how we ensure that those who were previously unremembered are now recognised for their contribution. And also the educational piece is really important. The story that they help tell to diverse communities worldwide as well.
I think it's super important. Again, we get lost in media sometimes, and we see, this over glorification of that frontline soldier. These are people who sacrifice their lives in service as well, and to forget them, not to be able to say their name on those special days like Remembrance Day and such. It's it's important, and the actions of being able to be part of that, for you to just recover these names so we can share those stories again, is phenomenal.
It's a modern pragmatic take, and I see it as such, because I think You could go back 100 years and say, people at that time might not necessarily have viewed or perceived laborers in the same way they would have seen, fighting soldiers. But that's not an excuse, and I think it's fantastic, and it's a great story in itself to be able to say an organisation such as the Commonwealth War Graves has been able to really be pragmatic about it and say, actually, that might have been the view back then, but our view now, and indeed the community sentiment and the mindset out there, is to ensure that those who are still, a very important part of the story, as you describe, are given an opportunity to be remembered, and people who are connected to them feel that they're able to tell their story as well.
That's part of that history, and I think that's part of that belonging too, right? We put the uniform on. We're all part of our retrospective countries, but the Commonwealth, like I always feel a special connection to all the other Commonwealth countries because of that unifying piece. And a lot of that goes back to that history of service, and I think that's important because that's about connection. When I think of commemoration, in a lot of ways, it's about connection, it's about empathy and finding those connections, and we're telling stories that allow people to access that. And that's what I'm hearing you do in a very important way, especially for the Sikh culture as well, because there's even just sitting and listening and learning even more just from you here. That's really important. And I want to just kind of bring some attention again to the World War One Sikh Memorial, and maybe you can help our listeners understand what that's all about and your involvement there.
In the UK, we have the National Memorial Arboretum, which is a rather large park in the centre of England, so it's really accessible for people north, south, east, west, set out and dedicated as a space by the Royal British Legion of where people go to remember. And they're therefore in that space. There are a lot of memorials to a lot of past conflicts and modern conflicts as well. So everything from in the modern setting, the Falklands through to Iraq and Afghanistan are remembered there and commemorated there. So people have the opportunity, if they're connected to an individual, maybe lost their life, or a regiment that has served, to go there and see the memorial, but also in a very peaceful, tranquil setting to reflect upon the past. And it became apparent during the centenary of the First World War anniversary, so in 2014, that there was a community need to recognise the Sikh contribution. I took it upon myself to lead a project to create a memorial at that site, and that's the World War One Sikh Memorial. It's a memorial of a Sikh soldier, but not an individual soldier, because as Sikhs we don't believe in deifying any individual. So it represents all Sikhs who served. And again, it's based around the image, turban beard, distinctly different and recognizable for our principles and tenets of faith with Sikh identity. And it helps tell the story of the 124,245 Sikhs as part of the Indian Army at the time, who served and fought in every arena of the war, from the Western Front through to East Africa, Mesopotamia, so modern-day Iraq, and indeed on the northwest frontier with India as well. And for a short period of time, even in Tsingtao in China. And what we do there is every year we gather there, first Sunday of November, to commemorate Sikh service. But it also, kind of more important probably than that, is how we project that, both the image, both the training packs and the educational work that we do, to the wider communities at large, not just the Sikh community, but also those who are interested or indeed have never heard about Sikh contribution, and by extension the Commonwealth contribution, because we do talk about the fact that it wasn't just Sikhs that served, but people from all walks of life and different backgrounds from across the Commonwealth. And so it's become a really important part of storytelling. And often, as we'll see in a few weeks' time, with national commemoration events, so VJ Day 80 coming up, because of that distinguishable feature of the Sikh soldier, we often get recognised in media, etc., because it helps tell that story. And it's something we're quite proud of, because it again enables us to be able to say, World War One, World War Two wasn't just a white Western war. There were people drawn from all sorts of diverse backgrounds, different walks of life, who served for various reasons. People in Canada would have served for a very different reason to people in India. But the fact is, they did serve and they did sacrifice, and people did die, and we owe it to them to remember them, but also to ensure that their names, their contribution, live on forevermore, but also enable or inspire future generations to look upon service as a public duty and something that is well worthy of doing.
One of the things we love talking about is story. And before we wrap up, I'm wondering if you might have a particular story of a veteran or something that you've heard in the past that really resonates with you.
It's a Gurkha story that's connected to my brigade. And I mentioned earlier, I visited some of those World War II sites in Burma some years ago, but there was a particular place just in the northeast of Burma where a young Gurkha called Tul Bahadur Pun undertook a heroic action which would eventually see him receive the Victoria Cross. And I remember it because I was asked, we were stood there as part of our group at this exact location where this action took place. We were looking across at the railway bridge where they were advancing towards, this was the Chindits, the river nearby, so it was quite a strategic position, and there was something called the Red House where a number of his colleagues were pinned down, and he undertook an action, and I read out his citation at that location. And it was quite moving in the heat and being there and seeing the ground and the lay of the land, and also with other veterans, kind of just getting a sense and shivers down my spine even now talking about it. And that's a story I always remember and think back. And indeed, just earlier this week, in fact, I was in an army barracks visiting for some work, and I looked up in the mess hall to see a big painting on the wall of Tul Bahadur Pun. So I was like, I know him. And I've been there, and I was kind of trying to kind of get others to take an interest. But that's always the one that comes to mind, because I think kind of it's one thing reading a citation or reading what someone's done, but to be there, to be stood there, to see the environment where they took this action and heroism is quite something else. And you mentioned my history background. It's something I don't think I've kind of scratched the surface of in terms of reading, researching, and wanting to help tell those types of stories in unique ways to many more people.
That story in and of itself just gives me shivers too. Just that dedication to their brother in arms right next to them and to their mission, and it always inspires me to go, if I could have like an ounce of what these men had and put it towards the work and just service today, that's something that inspires. And I think that's why that connection to the past becomes so important.
That sort of inspiration you can't buy. It's the sort of thing that really moves you and wants you to do great deeds, as I always say, regardless of whatever you're doing in life. Just sometimes reflecting upon the past and being inspired into the future goes a long way. And it's something I think within the military setting, we can see across the board isn't kind of distinct or unique to your peoples or your regiment or your country. It's always moving to understand and see from other militaries and other nations how they are inspired and indeed the stories that those contributions tell as well.
Is there a book you would recommend for people who are interested and want to know a little more about the Sikh involvements in different wars?
Let's see. There's one I keep nearby, which is this one, India and the Great War by Rana Chinna. I'd highly recommend that as kind of encapsulating kind of the contribution from the undivided Indian subcontinent during the World War period. But I think there are a plethora of books. The other one is Slim's Defeat to Victory, which is a classic, which I think I would recommend anyone interested in Burma World War II. And I think kind of Burma is the one where I would focus more on, and definitely with Slim, because I think it's often overlooked and forgotten. Obviously, the attention was very much kind of fighting Nazism, but it's one where there are so many lessons to be drawn and learned that are still relevant to this day.
Jay, this is great. If people want to learn more, what kind of socials, what kind of websites would you like to share?
Just Google me, Jay Singh-Sohal, JAY-SINGH-SOHAL. As well as the WW1 Sikh Memorial, and you'll find our website.
Jay, thank you so much for coming on. I could talk to you for hours here because you can see you have so much information and stories to share. I really appreciate your time. And to our listeners, please take a look at those socials, check out those books, and we look forward to having you again.
Thanks so much for tuning in. Story Behind the Stone is available on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, and on the Wreaths Across America radio network, on iHeartRadio, Audacity, and Tune In. Just search for Wreath. We air every Thursday at 10 a.m. Eastern on the Wreaths Across Radio Network. Thank you for tuning in.